happy to deliver this lecture today. But yeah, I don't know whether we can really divide the session into one lecture session and then a very long discussion, because I actually already included quite some discussion moments within the lecture to make it more interactive, because these online sessions can also be very tiring. Also, when I have to follow them, sometimes I'm almost falling asleep if you just have to listen. Particularly now that you might already have had dinner, or you're waiting for dinner and you're growing hungry. So I will try to make it as interactive as possible. And indeed, international student mobility and migration has been of interest to me scientifically since, let me think, 2008, when I wrote my first journal article while I was studying in a master in international migration at the University of Valencia and the Catholic University of Lille in France. And from that, a whole research career on international student mobility unfolded. That was not really the plan in the beginning, but look, here I am again after 13 years. And it was great to see that what I will be showing you as well is how the field particularly developed, because when I started in 2008, I started because nothing was available at the time. I had some subjective experiences, one can say, when I was living in Madrid and Valencia and Lille, in terms of social engagement with other Europeans. And then I wanted to see, okay, we feel more European. The European Commission thinks that we would become more European through the Erasmus program, etc. But what does science say? And so I discovered that actually there was virtually no scientist except Russell King, who was working on international student mobility. And when I met him the first time, that was very a good example, I think, of the place of student mobility, for example, within the EuMIGS network, to which these lecture series are also connected. Then you would have one or two presentations on international student mobility in the group that was talking about aging. So that was like kind of the aging and the students migration. Scholars were in these small rooms with very few people that came to listen. And if you go to the EuMIGS conference right now, you see quite a lot of presentations on the topic. So the field definitely changed and advanced quite a lot, which also makes it quite challenging, I would say. So today I will give you first an overview of trends of international student mobility. I know that you also have the lecture of Yvonne Riaño from last year, so you can also rewatch that lecture, where she also provides part of, actually she based the statistics part on a chapter that I sent her. So I won't be repeating that lecture, and I will show some additional figures here that complement basically that lecture. And then afterwards I will dive more deeply into, okay, how can we better understand international student mobility, and what kind of approaches and theories do we have available to come to more holistic understanding on international student migration. And I will ask you as well to reflect upon that, and then we will see where we end. Oh yeah, and one other thing, two other things. One thing is that I'm very bad at keeping the chat, so Marcel, if you could just interrupt me when there is any interesting chat message, that would be great. And secondly, I also have the tendency to speak fast sometimes when I get excited, which is almost all the time when I lecture. So if you don't understand anything, if something was not clear, please do not hesitate also to interrupt me and to ask what I mean, or to dive deeper into certain subtopics. Okay, so setting the stage, right? So the context. What do we talk about in terms of numbers when we talk about international student mobility? We're talking about, at this moment, around 6 million students that are studying abroad international, or studying abroad across the globe. And if you compare it, of course, to the 70s, then you see that this is a very massive increase. And international student migration has been calculated by several scholars, is actually today one of the the fastest growing migration form across the world. So it grows much faster compared to labor migration, compared to family migration, compared to asylum flows. So it is one of the most rapidly growing flows of international migration, or categories of international migration. And so you see that for this figure first shows you the students that go abroad for a full degree. So for example, when I went to study at the University of Valencia, that was for a whole master in international migration. Then I was a degree mobile student, because I would get my degree from two institutions, Lille and Valencia. But of course, you also have international student exchanges, which is a different form of international student mobility, because then you gain your degree at your home institution. For example, the University of Antwerp, where I studied, and then you can go on an Erasmus stay at the University of Valencia, but you would return and your degree would not be of the University of Valencia, but it would be of the University of Antwerp, of course, or Osnabrück, or any other institution that you might be based at. But also, when we look at these exchange programs, here you see also the figure for the Erasmus program. We see that since 1987, when the Erasmus program started, that the increase is very significant, right? And this is, for example, a graph that the European Commission very often shows, and which tends to illustrate, or which is used very often by researchers, both graphs, to illustrate the magnitude of the phenomenon, and it's also trying to kind of indicate the importance of looking at it. Then I have a question to you. So we see these graphs. So here you see from 3,000 students to 330,000 students in a period of roughly 30 years. Here we see the same from 0.8 million to 2025, 8 million international students projected. Do these numbers tell the whole story? And if we really want to assess the magnitude of international student mobility, or the relevance of student mobility, what other numbers would we need? And that's an open question to all of you. Let's see, in Belgium we have something we call a Chinese volunteer. So Paula, can you throw in some ideas here?
Sorry, wait 1 second. Trying to. All right. I think maybe it would also be important to know the numbers of the institutes if it changed where the people are going and where they're coming from, like the destination universities, if this changed, or also maybe if the destination countries are the same countries who also go abroad a lot, or like this.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it does not tell us anything about the directions of international student flow. So that's a very good one. And if you read the literature that that I suggested, then you will see in the paper of Yassar also that indeed looking only at the global level and considering student migration as something from the global south to the global north is not doing justice to the complexity of the phenomenon. Jens is indicating how many students are completely mobile, spending their entire studies somewhere else. Well, that is the first graph, actually, Jens. So that's the graph where we have these 8 million students, projected. What I was thinking is rather that we could look at other numbers like this, for example, right? What do we see here? We see actually a same graph or same trend, an upward trend. And what we see is graduation rates of people in tertiary education. So what we see here is that basically, together with the rise in international student numbers, the typical rise in absolute numbers, we also see more people that are graduating in higher education. And so if you start to look at how many people also graduate in higher education and then compare that to international student mobility numbers, then we get quite a different graph, right? And then we get a much more stable trend. Still, for some countries, it's higher than other countries, and there are fluctuations which are to be expected. But overall, then we see that the magnitude that these first figures kind of scream to you, that it's not as large as expected. And if you look at the world scale, then we're talking about a few percentages only of all higher education students that graduate that have an international mobility experience. So that the next question then logically is, okay, which I call it here famous international migration number and insight. To which famous international migration number and insight can you connect these relative numbers? There is also a number in migration studies that's very often used to indicate or to kind of warn against using absolute numbers and to kind of calm down a bit the claims about the massive rise and the fact that we would live in the age of migration, for example. Anyone?
I'm not sure if I know the number. It's like, I don't know, is it the absolute number of like people, like refugees outside of the country, and then it's set into contrast with in German we call it Binnenmigranten, so people that stay inside their home countries, and it shows that migration over borders isn't just like the same big number as it is with migration within borders, but I don't know the numbers.
Yeah, but that's excellent thinking, Lei. That's exactly what it means. If you look at international migration on a global scale, and then we can there do the same, then we see that actually the number of or the share of international migrants on the world population is remaining relatively stable since the 70s, and it's always oscillating around 3%. Which is a number that you might have encountered already in the lecture series. I don't know, Marcel, is that true or not at all? Not yet. Okay.
Not yet.
So that's an interesting thing, right? So very often, Monday I started my global migration lecture, and I asked students like, okay, can you please in an online questionnaire indicate the percentage or the share of the world population that is an international migrant today? And the highest number that was mentioned was 76%. So we very often have this idea that a massive number of people are international migrants, but actually we are only talking about 3% of the world population. And that means, to flip the coin, that 97% of the world population is not an international migrant. So we're talking about a minority phenomenon here. And this is what Malmerich called basically the immobility paradox. And so what he said basically is that to understand, oh, I already have some visitors, it seems, to understand international migration, we always have to look also to immobility patterns, and we always also have to look at why the vast majority of people do not decide to move despite economic models, right? Despite these push-pull models that you have, for example, despite rational choice models, whereby it is expected that that people would move to conditions, to countries where they have better life chances. And so that is also what happened basically with international student. With now I'm a little bit confused because of the of Kobe who entered the room. No, and that's also what happened with international student mobility for a very long time. So in these studies, when I started to research this, there were a lot of studies on international students, and they would say they go for these reasons, and they would be asked like, okay, and if you compare your labor market outcomes to those who did not study abroad, how well do you think you fare on the labor market? And of course, they would say, yes, we have a massive advantage. And then we start to introduce this immobility viewpoint also since 2009, 2010. And that really led to a much more nuanced view on international student mobility. It allows for a much better assessment of, okay, what really drives international student migration? And also it really gives a better insight on what barriers exist to international student migration. And so overall, this immobility paradox, it basically leads to further sets of questions for migration studies, but also for international student migration, right? So why do so many people or higher education students, why do they not engage in international student mobility? Is it because they do not want to? Do they not have the need to? Is it maybe because of the social networks that they have? Is it maybe because of social class and the fact that they have certain jobs that they need to do outside of their university hours, which makes it impossible to go abroad? Is it because of culture? Is it because of familiarity, simply feeling home in this, like Paolo Boccani, when he did his research on homing in migration studies? And so that led some people, for example, to Jürgen Carling, which some of you might know, to redraw our attention from the age of migration, as the famous book of Castells and De Haas and Miller is called, to become the age of involuntary immobility, right? Where many people would like maybe to move abroad, but there are some structural constraints, which very often also for higher education students make it difficult to realize or capitalize on their aspirations. And so that's as a general intro to say that I look a lot on in my research to international student mobility and mobile students, but I think it's already important because I know that you also have to do some research project on international student migration within this course. That's correct, right, Marcel? So do not forget to thoroughly consider whether or not to include non-mobile students as well as a valid comparison point in order to be able to make thorough scientific analysis that allows to really make some nice claims afterwards, instead of relying on self-reports of students themselves after or during their stay abroad. I see some chats lighting up here. How is international migrant defined? You mean for the 3%? The 3% graph is based, Henna, on people that are living in a country that is not the country where they were born. That's how it's measured. So and then they just take the whole world population, and then they look at, okay, who's living in a country that's not the country where he or she was born, and then they come to these 3%. And of course, that number is always a little bit arbitrary, because you also have borders that are redefined, for example, and then suddenly people who never moved in their whole life might become an international migrant and might be included in that number, for example. Think about after the Second World War. That happened, right, with new borders of Germany, for example. It also happened in Sudan with independence of South Sudan. So there's all kind of geopolitical events also that kind of influence that number. But overall, generally, that's how they calculate it. They say the people who are living in a country that's not the country where they were born.
Yeah, but I was a bit thinking, like, because you were saying that the number is like pretty stable, like overall, like how many migrants and everything. So then, like, if we take it so that someone has moved to some other country, and that's clear, and there's no way the borders could shift that way, that like when a person is no more a migrant, basically. That's a bit like because in a way, like I'm maybe I'm thinking too much, but like if more people like every year some new people are moving, and then like the old ones are still like abroad, so to say, even though they might have been like for years or decades or whatever. So yeah.
No, but this is looking also at stocks of migrants. Maybe that's also indeed important. So we talk about, you have stocks and you have flows, right? And stocks is the number of people that are living in a certain country at a certain point in time. And then flows is about the number of people that are moving, for example, annually into a country. And the flow logically is much lower always compared to the stocks, because the flows, they only add to the stock. And of course there's people leaving as well and returning maybe, or moving onward. But so generally the stock is higher than the flow. And then also, of course, again here the same as what was it Leah? No, it was not Leah. Let me who indicated, was it Leah who indicated that did not take into account the directions of student migration flows, these numbers. The same actually also happens here in a sense that there's quite some disparities between countries, right? If you look at Switzerland, for example, then the share will be much higher compared to Poland. And when you compare Poland to the UK, there will be different numbers. So, but this is just a number on the world scale, which always masks this kind of disparities and inequalities in numbers between countries. But it illustrates something, right? To me, it particularly illustrates that we can never fully understand migration decisions if we do not look also at people who do not move. That's the main point, basically, that I want to make here. Is that okay?
Yeah, or like if I understood right, did you mean that like basically the flow of migration is like quite stable?
The stock of migrants is
okay.
quite
stable. Okay, yeah.
Okay, but then let's move to a quick historical overview of trends of international student mobility. And to do so, I just use a chapter that I finalized with Raoul Chuda from California for a handbook that we were asked to write, and we used UNESCO data. So you have the UNESCO database of educational statistics, which allows to map global international student migration flows. And we distinguish between 3 different waves of international student migration since the turn of the century, basically. And the first wave is from 2001 until 2008. And it started basically with the terrorist attacks on 9/11, which resulted in much more tight visa requirements for international students moving to the United States. So in 2001, you see that about a third of international students, they went to the United States. So it's still the largest receiver of international students, but as we will see, the panorama quite significantly changed, as you also could read in the article of Yassar. And at the same time, what we see is that the European higher education area start to take shape. The Bologna process also took off, which aimed to make this more comparable, coherent higher education system across Europe that we know right now. And the introduction of ECTS, for example, and the fact that you can do this EuMIGS course is also one of the results, I would say, from the establishment of the Bologna process, or the start of the Bologna process. But at that time, particularly Western countries were very important in terms of receivers, and particularly Anglo-Saxon countries, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. And many governments also had quite a favorable policy for international students, including the UK, for example. where they had primary initiatives for international education, which really tried to attract international students by lowering visa requirements, basically. The leading source countries at that time were China and India, and for a long time that would remain that way. But then 2008 marks a very significant shift in these global migration flows or student migration flows, because we had the global financial crisis, which started in the United States. And one of the most dramatic outcomes of the crisis was that the budget in higher education went significantly down. So governments, because of this crisis, needed to make sure to save some money. Higher education all across the world, particularly in the Western world, suffered from severe budget cuts. And that led to an increased interest in many countries in higher education institutions, particularly in attracting more international students. Why? Because they would pay more tuition fees compared to domestic students. And the same happens nowadays in Europe. If you ask some fellow students at the institutions where you're studying how much they pay to enroll at your institutions, and you compare European or EU students with non-European students, you can be amazed really about the amount of money that they have to pay to be able to enroll in a study program in Europe. And so international students became a very significant and important source of revenue for higher education institutions, which led to a lot of initiatives to attract them more, and many financial models were also based on the recruitment of international students. There was a study of UK universities, for example, in 2017, and they made some calculations, and they claimed that about 14-15% of the revenues of higher education institutions in the UK would be based on international student fees that they pay non-European students to come to study in the UK. So suddenly they became what we call them the cash cows of higher education system in the paper. That's how we call them. They became more important, and there were more active efforts by particularly higher education institutions, even more than governments, to attract international students to Western societies. At the same time, also globally, of course, power dynamics are shifting, and we have destinations like China, Brazil, but also Malaysia, for example, that were becoming much more important as destination countries. So the monopoly of Anglo-Saxon countries started here to fall down, and there were new competitive players. China, for example, they have these studying China programs. They also connected this to the Belt and Road initiatives, whereby they have some economic support for countries across the Silk Road. But they also would use it for scholarships for students from these countries to attract them more attractively to China, with the aim, of course, more diplomatic policy aims of soft power. And so what we see is that the power dynamics were changing, and that countries like China and Brazil were becoming more important as regional players. Also in that period, students received quite a lot more racist attacks. It's a period, well, economic crisis, as you might know from other courses, maybe very often lead to scapegoating, and then migrants very often are blamed for all the illnesses of the system and things that go wrong. So in this period also of the economic crisis, there was much more focus on students as being potentially bogus, misusing the student route to become irregular migrants, particularly China, for example. Chinese students were very much suspected of doing so, and so many countries became much more strict. And so that's what Summers and Collier described in their book Migration, when they say that previously, in the period up until 2008, there was this kind of red carpet policy whereby international students were very much welcomed in destination countries. Here still they're very much welcomed by the higher education institution because of the tuition fees, but governments became increasingly skeptical on international students and started in many countries, also particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, to consider them much more also as international migrants rather than being an exception category important for the global knowledge economies. And that led, for example, countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany also to do much more strict checks within China, for example, previously to departing to Europe, to be sure that students would not be becoming irregular migrants upon arrival. And also in terms of general societal sphere, there was quite some reports of students who were subject to racist attacks. So the whole attitude towards international student migration seemed to change in that period. And then also we see that some European countries became much more attractive to students, because that's also a period when we saw that many more English taught programs became established. The Netherlands, that's why I have this picture, was very important there and became one of the important destination countries. But in many other countries also, English taught whole programs were established with the aim to attract more international students, which took them away from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, from the United Kingdom as potential destinations. And then finally, you read the paper of Yasser Kondakci. We see new regional hubs emerging. So, for example, Malaysia became quite important as a destination country. Turkey became very important also in the region as a destination country. Saudi Arabia also tried to attract many more students in the region. And then what you also saw is that many higher education institutions in the Western world start to establish these branch campuses. So, which means that, for example, the University of Nottingham, they would start a branch campus in Malaysia. That's a famous one. And then students from within the region would become international students to Malaysia to get a degree of the University of Nottingham. So a European degree, while either not moving because they would simply remain in Malaysia, but become an international student because they were in the program of the University of Nottingham. So that also challenges traditional conceptualizations of international students. Or they would move within the region from neighboring countries to Malaysia, but then to enroll in a European program. And so I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but I remember having read one of these papers a couple of weeks ago by Stefan Wilkins, who is one of the authorities on these branch campuses. And around 2012, if I remember well, there were already around 200 branch campuses around the world of higher education institutions trying to attract international students. Also, they would pay the European fees. That's also important. So they would get the revenue, but in terms of finances and the costs that you have, of course, that is much lower also for the students themselves, because they don't have to travel to a country where everything is much more expensive. And then 2016 until today, there were also quite some significant changes. So on the one hand, we see that Trump was elected, and that led to quite some anti-migration policies, particularly against Muslim countries. And so the United States, the share of international students that went to the United States continued to go down. So they were losing their first position in the world. Well, they're still the main destination country, but there is more diversity, and the share that they have is going down every year. Then you have the Brexit, and the Brexit, of course, also went together with particularly anti-migration rhetoric and led also to the British government to define international students also as migrants, which led to a whole new set of visa requirements also for international students, making it harder to enter the United Kingdom, leading also to a drop in students going to the United Kingdom. But you see this more restrictive rhetoric that we also see in general migration policies and in policy debates, also trickling down to debates on international student mobility, because there were also discussions in Belgium, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland on how many international students. I wrote down how many students, but actually it's how many international students the system can support. Do we need to pay the education? And that's the question that you then get in the parliamentary debate. Do we have to pay the education of German students who come to study psychology in the Netherlands? Is that something that the Dutch taxpayer should pay? And these kind of questions are not unique to the Netherlands. In Belgium, that discussion goes about the Dutch people, Dutch students who come to study in Belgium. In Denmark, it's about students from Scandinavian countries that come to study there. In Switzerland, it's also about the neighboring countries, German students that go to Switzerland, but also French students that come to study in Switzerland. So we see this much more skeptical approach from the policy side at the macro level against international or on international students. Compared to the early 2000s, when everything was positive and students would really contribute to economic growth. In the meantime, fees still kept on rising, so international students kept on being an important source of income, and the more severe the budget cuts continued, the more fees were charged to international students. And then, of course, we have the COVID-19 pandemic that heavily impacted international student mobility. And today we still don't really know what the impact is on enrollment numbers in different countries. It seems to be very disparate. So in some countries like the UK, there is a massive decrease in number of international students. But then the question is that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, or is that because of Brexit? In countries like France also there is a massive decrease of students, but in Sweden, for example, we see a massive increase of students, the same in Poland. So today I'm not aware yet of any study that really maps nicely the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on these trends, but that's also because data only starts to become available right now, and to do this kind of international comparative analysis, particularly on a regional or world scale, is, as far as I know, not yet possible. So we will have to wait a bit to see what the impact is. But overall, the main trend that one can say, or that one observes since the turn of the century, is that governments have become much more restrictive in terms of managing international student migration compared to the 90s, when there was a much more positive rhetoric. And the consequences of this whole shift, I would say, and of these developments, is that it becomes more difficult for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to engage in international student mobility, because the costs of international student mobility have risen quite significantly. And logically, that also means that there is quite an increase in inequalities, right? With privileged people having more routine access to international student mobility, others not. But that also means, and that's the interesting part here, that also leads to the emergence of middle-income countries as destinations, like China, Malaysia, Mexico, Singapore. And if you're interested in this, there is a new emerging scholar, Benjamin Mulvey, from the University of Hong Kong. He just graduated a couple of months ago. He got his PhD, and he did some very nice analysis on the destination choice process and the decision-making process of African students, particularly to choose their study destination. And here really shows the considerations that they have, right? So the classical idea of, okay, let's go to a Western university to get a good education, but then they start to calculate how much that will cost, and then you have countries like Singapore, like China, like Turkey, are also actively recruiting students, offering scholarships, and then they say they can get value for their money there as well. It's a second choice. But so you see that way, because of these inequalities, these middle income countries also really rise as new study destinations, which is a fascinating and interesting development, I would say. Okay. Is everybody still on board so far? It's always difficult to see with the black screens, but I see some stumps, so that's okay. But then now we come more to the conceptual part, and maybe within 10 minutes or so we have a short break. But I want you to think first something true before we go to the more conceptual thing, because we're talking here about international student migration. And there is some discussion in the academic literature, and there are some severe supporters of the idea that international students are migrants. But other people say, well, that's not possible to consider international students as migrants because they're very different, and we should not analyze international student migration with the same analytical lens as we analyze international migration. And so I propose that I divide you in a couple of breakout rooms and that we discuss for about 5. I will join one of the groups, and that we discuss for about 5 minutes some arguments in favor or against the idea that international students are migrants. What would you think that conceptually we can consider them migrants, and what do you think are arguments to say that conceptually this is not possible at all and we should consider them as something completely different? So let's see for some breakout rooms. Oh, I'm not able to make them probably, Marcel. That's
Can I allow you to do that, or should I do
I
it?
don't, if you make me host, probably that's
Yes.
you just make 4 breakout rooms, and then after 5 minutes you kick everybody out. That's also okay.
Okay, I just made you co-host.
Okay, let's see. Yes, and then I have the breakout rooms option. Okay, so let's make 3 rooms, so that's 3-4 participants per room, and then within a minute or 5 we come back to the main room. I will close the rooms, and then we see each other here again. And now they're open.
Schmecken.
Ach, das wird jetzt hier aufgenommen.
And I think we should talk in English.
We can do that.